Hello everyone, my name is Mark, and so I thought I'd upload to YouTube a presentation that I recently did for the International Conference of Game Theory and Management of 2021, which is hosted by St. Peter's University in Russia. However, when I was recording the presentation, what happened was my audio cut out halfway through the audio recorder I was using. I reached out to the conference organisers afterwards, but they declined to send their copy of the recording. So I thought I'd re-present and then upload for all to share. So in the conference, I presented a talk called an equilibrium theorem in nonlinear population matrix models. And so I thought I'd re-record my speech, my presentation. Yep. So my name is Mark. I'm from the Australian National University. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow. My email is there. Feel free to contact me. And this presentation was originally presented as of the 24th of June. So my purpose, like I think back in the day, I did some research on evolution. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to sort of extend evolutionary game theory, that is a subset of game theory designed for modeling evolution, to more complicated situations. So, motivation: to extend evolutionary game theory to model more things. Now, just a brief overview, the standard of evolutionary game theory is that you have a situation where you have fixed strategies of some sense, and what happens is of these organisms in a population with fixed strategies, they are stochastically paired randomly, and then what happens is those two individuals that are paired play a game with each other, some kind of simple game, and then from that game they get respective fitness payoffs, which then inform how fast that strategy grows within the population. So the standard example game is the hawk-dove game, right, where the idea is that you have like birds or whatever, where there's a hawk strategy and there's a dove strategy, or aggressive, non-aggressive. And the idea is that when a hawk meets a dove, the hawk gets all the resource and the dove gets nothing. Conversely, when a hawk meets a hawk, they compete with each other and expend resource that way, and then eventually split the resource. When a dove meets a dove, they directly split the resource. And the idea is that you have this population of hawks and doves, and they're randomly paired. And then what happens is the expected average fitness payoff from those pairwise interactions determines the growth rate via the replicator equation. And we can sort of plug that into a computer and eventually see that there is an equilibrium between the hawk and the dove strategies. Now, this is the sort of the canonical game that was described by Maynard Smith in his classic book, and has sort of got like wide, I mean, you wouldn't call it application, but like wide recognition as being a foundational step in evolutionary game theory. So the idea is that you set up a matrix and then you press play and then you see what happens. However, I suppose like one of the things that I had a problem with this sort of a thing is that I wanted to use evolutionary game theory to model more things. So, I mean, particularly for me historically, I wanted to see or to evaluate evolutionary explanations, particularly about human psychology and behavior, say, for instance, evolutionary psychology. And I suppose one of the things that I recognized was, if you used evolutionary game theory to try and derive like an explanation for why humans behave the way they do, there'd be a lot of criticisms. So the first is there's like what I would say is a whataboutism of factors, right? Like what about environment? What about class? What about upbringing, etc.? Like have you considered this other factor if you wanted to make an evolutionary model? And then there's also, like that can be valid, I suppose. And there's also like the contra objection. It's like, well, now that you've considered all of these things, how do we know that you just haven't constructed this sort of evolutionary model? Like the idea of an evolutionary just so, right? It's like, why don't we see unicorns with lasers? Well, in principle, we could imagine maybe there would be an evolutionary explanation for these things. So the idea is that, well, let's try and see what we can do to model whatever factors may exist faithfully. So, for instance, let's take an example, all right? So if we wanted to do an evolutionary game for the human model of, say, psychopathy, right? Like how do we know if psychopathy is something that is evolved, like what would we do? If we were going to use evolutionary game theory, what we'd have to do is to fill out like a little tiny table, right? Something like this, like what is the fitness payoff of being a psycho, right? We'd have to put that into a table and then ascribe some differential equations. And then maybe that would tell us how psychopathy emerged in some way. But if you think about it, like this is sort of a bit awful. Like genuinely, like perhaps a little bit simplistic would be the objection that would probably be justifiably raised. But the other thing is, like, what are the fitness values? Like if a psycho meets another psycho, like what fitness do they have? Is the fitness 1.08? Like, what are the units of fitness, and how would we know what the units are? So it's like, painful. So I just thought, when I was thinking about this, I kind of thought that evolutionary game theory just wasn't very useful, in actually modeling real evolutionary stuff. And so I did, like back in the day, I did a bit of research. Well, like what else is there? Surely there is something more. Right. So, anyway, so like conversely, like where evolutionary game theory might be too simple, what about resources? What about culture? What about class? What about randomness? What about location, mutation, selection, reciprocity? Like how do you model all of that? And the answer is, well, okay, you can obviously just throw it all into a computer. Let us make them more complex. So like one of the most extreme examples of throwing this all into a computer and trying to consider all of the factors at once, there's a thing called artificial life, right? Whereas basically you have like a virtual petri dish and you have little robots interacting, and you've got their little codes and they mutate. Let's bring it up. Right, so here is an example of a Darwin bots simulation. I remember Darwin bots was a program that I used to use when I was in high school that I was kind of fascinated by. And so on screen you've got all these little robots that interact, and what happens is they randomly interact with each other, they attack each other, they gather resources, and then they've got a little code that mutates when they reproduce. And the idea is that you can basically watch evolution on screen. However, the problem with these kind of simulations is that the results that you get are kind of stochastic, right? Like, you can run a simulation once and get something interesting happen, but it won't tell you why it happens, and then you run it again, and then the next time you do, you get nothing. Which is sort of interesting, but like it's a curiosity, but not necessarily very useful, for studying, these sorts of things, right? If you wanted to develop an evolutionary explanation as to why some particular behavior emerged, these things really wouldn't directly tell you that, right? So it's kind of like the trade-off. All right, so it's like artificial life is one possibility, but I thought, well, surely there is something that's between artificial life and evolutionary game theory, right? Something that can involve all of these complicated factors but aren't just purely simplistically mathematical. And so what I did was I did some research on population modeling and game theory, and I investigated and described a model for these sort of questions, and I made an equilibrium theorem. And then at some point I just moved on in life. So anyway, I'm taking you on a journey. So what have other people done? So there's lots and lots of work on population modeling. There's lots and lots of work on planning and game theory. And there's lots of good work extending game theory and evolutionary game theory to different environments, such as on graphs and grids. And there's lots of study on various evolutionary models, often in the biological literature, where they modeled some specific thing about evolution. So I don't really want to pretend like my work exists in a vacuum. Specifically, I want to shout out Ethan Altman, who was one of the organizers of the conference, particularly with his Markov decision evolutionary games. There's also a guy at the University of Arizona, I believe, J. Michael Cushing's, with his evolutionary different equations. There's a guy by the name of Thomas L. Vincent, who's done some good work on evolutionary G functions. And there's a guy named Hal Caswell. I've got his book on my bookshelf. and particularly his work on population matrix models is really good. So anyway, I just want to shout them out because they're good guys, and yeah, I want to see where this is good. Okay, so let us start with let's dig in. Okay, so if we want to model evolution, so one of the things that we can do is we ask the question, well, where do fitness values come from, right? And often the idea of fitness is that it is related to growth, right? Like the potential of genes to reproduce, the ability to provide offspring for the further generation, right? Against a gradient of natural selection or whatever else. And one of the best ways, that I could find, which I thought was particularly interesting, of modeling growth was with these things called population matrix models. So for instance, there is a thing called a Leslie matrix, which is used, I think, in ecology mostly. So the idea is that, on this matrix here on the top row, you have the F values, which are the rate of the number of offspring that are produced, and then P is the probability of survival into the next age bracket, right? So what happens is you apply this matrix to a vector, right? So, you have your population that might start being all young, and then you apply the vector, and then a certain probability will survive into adulthood and have X many babies, right? And then you apply the matrix again, and that will give you the population at time t+2, right? And the idea is that with each of these things, this matrix describes the propagation of, the propagation is called the vital rates of organisms from one state into the other within the population. So the idea is that when you run this thing, and you multiply this matrix over and over and over again, what you do is you eventually get a steady population profile and a steady growth rate. So the growth rate lambda is the eigenvalue of the matrix. Right, so that's cool. It's very useful. I think, so the other thing is that population matrix models are used just outside of simple Leslie matrix form. So this here is an example of a population matrix of a weed here in Australia. Describing the propagation or the vital rates between the states, right? Between seeds and small and medium and large size plants. Okay, so that's cool and very interesting. So one of the things we can do is we can sort of plot this matrix as a bit of a graph, right? So for instance, each of these values between the states, we can draw little nodes and lines between them. So between 0, 1, 2, and 3, we can see a little graph drawn down below. So particularly those who are familiar with Markov decision models might be able to recognize this. Sort of look familiar. Now the idea is, okay, so what we can do is with a thing like this, we can basically extend it a little bit, right? So in the Markov decision world, you have actions and states and strategies or policies that give different decisions based upon the state. So for instance, we might imagine there is a mutation in this kind of population which has different vital rates between the states. So for instance, we might imagine there is original population M, and then there's a mutation population M star, described by a different matrix. The idea being that, at state 1, the mutation matrix does something different, which results in different vital rates between the states. And consequently, the mutation strategy will have a different growth rate because it has a different matrix. Conversely, what we can do is we can imagine that there might be like half mutants, right? We can imagine a mixed strategy of these two, right? Which takes the mutant action like half of the time and the original action half the time, right? So that would result in a matrix that is, actually a linear combination of the column, right? So we have M alpha for some alpha between 0 and 1, and it's the same matrix except it's alpha, the original value, plus 1 minus alpha, the mutant value, right? And that consequently will have a different growth rate that is parameterized by alpha. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is just even via this simplistic analysis, we can conclude that the population will be stable, right, if the mutants lambda is less than the original lambda, right? Because if the mutants lambda were greater, then the mutant would increase in population at the expense of the original population, right? Basically saying that if lambda alpha is greater than lambda, or if the derivative of lambda with respect to alpha is not equal to 0, or particularly greater than 0, then we have instability. And in fact, one of the things is that the derivative of the eigenvalue of a matrix with respect to some of its parameters is, in more generally evolutionary literature, is actually a key stability criterion, but we can't go into that quite yet. All right, so one of the things is that this is like a way of introducing strategies into a matrix model, but we're not just interested in the standard matrix models because they're a little bit static. What we're interested in is we're kind of interested in branching out a little bit. So one of the things we do is we make the matrix itself a function of the population vector that exists. So these are called nonlinear population matrix models. And in principle, these can model a lot, right? So for instance, classic examples are density-dependent models, models of multiple species, genetic combinations, constrained resources, modeling of sexual selection, etc. There's a lot of work on these. But the problem is with a lot of these models, and I think the reason why they're scary is because, the first thing that you notice is that they're chaotic. Like even the classic logistic equation, right, that results in classic example of chaos, is an example of this if you really want to form it. And particularly, one of the things we do is I am interested in equilibrium in these nonlinear matrix models. All right, so let's do the formalism. Okay, so we have S as a set of states. We have A of S be a set of actions for a state S. We have W, which are the set of strategies. So in that, W, A, and S is the probability of taking action A in state S. We have P, S of W, that is the number of organisms in a state S with a strategy W. We have P star S of A, which is the number of organisms in a state S which are going to take action A dependent on their W. And we have T, which are the vital rates that depend upon, that go to state S when an execution A is executed, right? So this is all the formalism, we can go down that rabbit hole. But the consequence of all this formalism is that every strategy has its own matrix, right? With components M, I, J. Now what we do, one of the things is that we get around all of the difficulty of the nonlinearity in these models by saying we're just interested in equilibrium, right? And we define an equilibrium as the case whereby every strategy has a constant matrix, right? That is, that all of the nonlinearity is completely irrelevant because we're only interested when the matrix stay constant, right? And we also define an equilibrium as that when every strategy is growing or decaying at the same maximal rate, right? The idea being that if there was a strategy that was possible with a greater growth rate, then it would dominate the population, and if there were a population with a lesser growth rate, then it would gradually be eliminated. Now, we define the equilibrium point in this context by the population profile that gives the matrices that are constant, right? So if you have two ways of generating the same population profile, then consequently all the matrices would be the same and you would have the same equilibrium. Now, the central theorem, for every stable equilibrium point defined by the population profile of mixed strategies, there is a set of pure strategies which give the same equilibrium point P star. The consequence of this is that if you're looking for equilibrium in these complicated models, you don't need to consider mixed strategies. Right, now, why would you care about this? Okay, so the first thing is, I'll just jump ahead a few slides. The first reason that you would care about this sort of a theorem is that, in these kinds of models, which can model a lot, if you want equilibrium, you don't need to worry about mixed strategies. Means that you can eliminate a lot of strategies from your consideration. The other thing is that it sort of is interesting if you think about it widely enough, that nonlinear systems that are evolutionary are only categorized by the pure points that exist, the actual behaviors rather than the genetic representation of them. But they're sort of interesting. I'll come back to that. Right, so let's go through the maths. So the maths is a multi-stage process, and the first thing I want to do is I want to refer to the preprint of the manuscript, which is preprints.org. But the general idea is that we've just got a bunch of basic matrix math. All right, so the first thing to prove is that if you have a matrix and you vary its column by some alpha, right, then the eigenvalue of the matrix, that is the spectral radius of the matrix, is either strictly monotonic or constant, i.e. it goes up, or it stays constant, or it goes down. It doesn't go up and down like crazy. Right, so this is basically saying that if there is a mutant in the population, then its growth rate, as you vary the presence of its mutation, is either increasing or decreasing or stays constant. Right. The second thing that's possible to do is to define that for that maximally changing growth rate, there is a linearly changing eigenvector, right? So that the eigenvector corresponding to that linear change in growth is changing linearly as well. And particularly also if the kth is the index of the column that is being varied, that also changes. That the eigenvector's kth component stays constant. Now, the idea is therefore that what we can do is we can decompose mixed strategies into pure ones. So we focus particularly on the kth column. So if we've got multiple mutants on the kth column, we say, okay, let's take a visual image. We have a simplex between strategies P1, 2, and 3, and then we have a mixed strategy beta in the mixed of that, right? So what we do is we basically take like a linear interpolation between the strategy beta and any of the pure strategies, and then we parameterize that by an alpha. What we can do is then we say, okay, so we know that the eigenvalue is either increasing or decreasing along that path because it's a linear, and we previously established that. So we know that it's either increase or decreasing. And then from that, what we know is the eigenvalue is changing linearly along that path as well. Because of this, what we can do is we can describe, because it's linear along that path, we can describe it as a mix alpha of the eigenvalues of the two most extreme, right? So P1 is the pure strategy P1, right? And then we have beta minus P1, which is a mixture of the strategies P2 and P3 that does not include any component P1, right? So its eigenvalue will be, so the population eigenvalue of beta will be equal to alpha times the population eigenvalue of P1 plus 1 minus alpha times the population value of beta minus P1. So in this way, for a kth column, we have decomposed a strategy of beta into P1 and not P1. Right. Conversely, then we can also draw a line between P2 and P3 about beta minus P1, and then we can decompose beta into components P1, P2, and P3. Now, this is kind of high level, so I do refer you to the manuscript if you really want to know more. So the idea is that, therefore, if we can decompose a mixed strategy on the kth column into pure strategies, then what we can do is we can take those strategies that are decomposed on the kth column and then decompose them on the kth plus 1th column, and then also the kth plus 2 column, until eventually what we have is we have basically pure strategies alone, and that is the theorem. Again, refer to the manuscript. For every stable equilibrium point defined by the population vector P star, established by mixed strategies, there is a set of pure strategies which gives the same equilibrium point, i.e. in looking for equilibrium, you don't need to worry about mixed strategies. Now, some points of note is that this redundancy of mixed strategies is not true in the case that we're not talking about equilibrium, so that's important. And that indeed searching for equilibrium in nonlinear systems is very hard. But, it's something. So, all right, finish with a simple illustration. Supposing, for instance, that you have a school of indistinguishable fish, and half of which gradually turn red at adolescence. A case with 100% of the population having a gene with 50% chance of turning red is indistinguishable from a 50% population having a gene of 100% chance of turning red, and that this is true no matter what. right? So this is whatever factors you want to consider. Any questions?